Kaggle Notebook courses. Here we are in the courses page. You'll notice that there are a whole list of different courses. The first one at the top of the list, which is the most fundamental, which is Python. So if you're logged in, you can click on Python. You can see here that there's a list of lessons that we're going to go through in this first subsection. The first one being Hello Python, which is really the first tutorial and introduction to the Python programming language. So I've already started up this tutorial over here, and this is the Kaggle notebook format, which was introduced previously. You can see from the green light here that the draft session is on, meaning the kernel is running and the Python backend or kernel is waiting for instructions. Python, of course, which has been introduced, is a fundamental programming language, which the syntax is very unique, which we'll go through here in a second. There's various foundational concepts that we'll cover, and by the end of this video, you'll have a sense of how to get started. So if you want to know a little bit about the background of Python, it was actually named after Monty Python. So there's a link here. You'll notice in the Kaggle notebooks that you have both text cells, which is this first cell, which you can see highlighted here with this black shaded area here on the left. And then there are code cells. So here you have this text cell, which is explaining what is going on in this first code cell. This code cell has a bunch of different Python concepts all wrapped into one chunk of code. And as was shown before, you can execute this line of code by clicking on the little triangle here in the upper left-hand corner of the code cell. You can also use on your keyboard Shift Return or Shift Enter to run it. And you'll notice that this first chunk of code has executed and the results down here have been shown. So since you're just maybe getting started with Python, we're going to unpack, as the text cell below says, we're going to unpack this. We're going to look at the different parts of what this chunk of code is as your introduction to Python and explain bit by bit how this works. So first of all, the most foundational aspect of any programming language is the concept of a variable or a placeholder of data. In this case, you have spam_amount equals 0. If we click on that, what happens is that Python has been told to store the number, or to basically store 0 in the variable that's been named spam_amount. So in Python, setting a variable to a certain value is done automatically. You don't have to declare the variable like you do in a lot of other programming languages. It's all just taken care of in this first line of code. Since we did this very basic effort of setting a variable to a value, the Kaggle notebook has not given us any response to that. Basically, the Python kernel has accepted that we've set this value to this variable, and when we've executed it, nothing basically happened. To see what is inside a variable, we'll use our first function call in Python using what's called the print statement. And print is something that is a very useful function that we use quite a bit, which shows what's inside a certain variable. So here when we execute this code cell, you'll notice that print with spam_amount in parentheses produces the 0. The output is 0, which shows what's inside of that function. So let's move on to the next line of code that we saw in that code chunk. We're going to basically create a new variable. We're going to set the existing variable spam_amount to the original variable +4. So this is what's called a reassignment of value. So basically doing something to the original variable spam_amount. If we do that, we're adding 4 to the spam_amount. And if we go back up and show print spam_amount, you'll notice that now it is 4. This is a situation where you'll notice that variables are not static. They can be reassigned. You can apply different types of arithmetic and things like that. So the next chunk of code, you'll notice that we'll get a little bit of exercise in what's called conditionals, or basically statements which test a variable based on a certain set of criteria. In this case, we're asking if spam amount is greater than 0, you'll say print out, but I don't want any spam. and then Viking song, spam, print the Viking song. So if we run this line of code, you'll notice that spam amount underscore amount is 4. So we reassign that variable to the number 4, and it is greater than 0. Therefore, this print statement was indicated. So this is an exercise in understanding how Python does what's called conditionals. You'll notice very quickly that in this there's a hierarchy here where Python is being told there's a condition. If spam amount is greater than 0, print a certain statement. You'll notice that there's a sort of nested nature to this, where the print statement is an index or a tab 4 spaces over from the line above it. This is how Python actually indicates that there's a hierarchy for certain statements, like the if statement. So if you remove that, you would actually run into an error. In this next bit of code, instead of using the plus sign as we did above, we're using the star sign, which indicates that we want to multiply spam underscore amount, this time by a string, which is basically going to create an output of spam. In the next section, let's look at numbers and arithmetic in Python. So just like a calculator, Python is able to add, subtract, multiply, divide, and various other things to a variable or number. And so to understand how this works, we'll redefine spam underscore amount as 0. And first look at what is a type. And so in Python, there are various data types. Int or int or integer is one of them. Whole numbers, essentially, including 0, which we have as assigned to spam underscore amount. Another type of data type is a float. A float is a number that has a decimal point and usually has more precision beyond just a whole integer. And these two data types, integer and float, you're able to apply addition, subtraction, multiplication, exponentiation, negation, all the different operators that you could on a calculator. You have a list here which shows those different operators and a description of what they do. Some of them are different than usual. For example, true division, which is dividing a number by another number, 5 divided by 2, 6 divided by 2, as well as an operator which allows you to divide by a number but round down to the next integer. There are additional operators beyond what you might find in just a calculator in and of itself. The last section that we'll talk about here is the order of operations, which is really important in the context of any arithmetic. You might remember from grade school where you learned about this, but we'll review this in the context of using Python. Of course, parentheses goes first, exponents, multiplication, division, addition, subtraction. This manifests itself here. You can see that 8 minus 3 plus 2, it's basically executed from left to right. Whereas here you have 4 times 2 executed first, and then negative 3 plus 8, essentially. You're doing this 4 times 2 first, and then the addition part. Down here, the next chunk of code you see here is an example of a situation where you're trying to calculate the total height of somebody, and one of them has their height in centimeters. Sorry, both of the heights are in centimeters, and you want to add them together, but you want to divide the entire addition of the 2 centimeters by 100, which will give you meters. So if you run this, you will get 26.9 meters because the height of centimeters of the person is divided by 100 and then added to this, which is not what you want. So obviously you want to include parentheses, which gives you a more reasonable number of 2.15 meters. So the order of operations is really important in programming, just like it was when you learned it in grade school. So the last couple things, there's built-in functions where you can find the minimum and maximum of a certain set of numbers. You can also do the absolute value. So basically taking negative numbers and applying the absolute value to them. And finally, the 2 main numerical types can be converted to each other. So here you can see where float 10 is using float. You can convert integers to floats. You can convert floats to integers and vice versa. And really diving into that in later sections and videos, you'll be able to see the power and the reasons for that. Now I'll pass it off to the next video, which is going to dive into the first programming exercise, which give you a sense of how to solidify your knowledge in these initial concepts.